Mixing is hard. Much harder, arguably, than mastering. Now, harder because, unlike mastering a single stereo file, you're dealing with dozens, sometimes hundreds more tracks. It's also harder because it can involve repair work, like waveform edits to fix timing problems or restoration work to remove clicks and pops that, if left unresolved, can increase in loudness when you move on to creative processing like compression, delay, and reverb. There's also tuning, phase, polarity challenges, and so much more. But here's the thing. Mixing doesn't have to be a burden, because in this video, we're going to walk you through the ins and outs of getting a mix off the ground, sounding great, and ready for mastering. So sit back and get ready to learn how to mix if you're not a mix engineer. A couple of things before we get started. It's important to know that you should be working with quality ingredients before you ever start mixing. We've talked a lot about the good rule on this channel. And if you're new, it goes something like this. Good singer, good microphone, good mic technique, good cable, good preamp equals good result. Multiply that good rule philosophy across all aspects of the production, and you'll end up with a good sounding multitrack that you can make great in the mix and legendary in mastering. It's hard to get a great mix truly great if you're starting with bad tracks. So these tips are going to assume that you followed the good rule or your clients have. So once you have all your good ingredients, it's time to start cooking. And one more thing, this video is going to assume that you're mixing something that has some acoustic instruments involved, like a real guitar and or real drums. But if you're mixing just loops, there's still a ton to learn here. So without further ado, here's tip number 1. Ever tried making dinner in someone else's kitchen? It can be impossible to move quickly because you don't know where things you need are stored. You have to open every drawer and cabinet to find the right tools, the pots, the pans, the cutting boards, basters, meat thermometers, etc. Not only are you moving slowly and wasting your time, but you're more likely to get frustrated and be in a bad mood altogether as you prepare that hypothetical meal. Mixing in a digital audio workstation can feel similar if you haven't taken the time to organize your mix session. Every track name reads like something from the Dewey Decimal System, and they're all the same color. So unless you're an expert waveform decoder, you have no idea what's on the other side of that track unless you play it, which you should, by the way, and more on that later. This is why it's critical to organize the session in a way that makes you feel like no matter what dish you're cooking, you're in your own kitchen and you know where everything is. So clean up the names of the tracks, group them in order of instrument or frequency. Yeah, some people do that. And give them colors so at a glance you know what food group you're mixing. Some people save time altogether by creating mixing templates and then dragging their tracks into it when they start a mix. I'd recommend that once your instruments are named and grouped, you should bus them in one group per instrument category. Now, you can control the loudness of each instrument group easily with just one fader. Whatever your system is, it's important to have a system, especially if you're a beginner. This is going to give you a great sense of structure and zen when you're preparing your tracks for mixing. To learn more about this process, take a look at the pop-out link above from our Are You Listening mixing series. A lot of mix tutorials that you see online featuring your favorite pro mixer don't always show you the critical work that goes into making sure that every track is truly ready for the mixing stage. Now, we've already discussed organizing your mix in the previous tip, but did you know that listening through all the tracks for any pops, clicks, dropouts is another important task that needs to happen before you touch a fader? Most mix engineers have an assistant that handles this important step. The assistant's job is to provide crucial quality control so that the mixing stage can run as smoothly as possible. Common issues that might get treated in the repair stage involve plosives. These are P-pops when air hits the capsule from a sung or spoken word. clicks and mouth sounds, or hum and buzz that infiltrated a guitar amplifier. Luckily, treating these problems is easy and often automatic with iZotope RX. In fact, there's a tool called Repair Assistant, which you can use to automatically scan for these problems and then remove them. There's special settings in the assistant to tackle instruments, vocals, and more. You can also choose to fix the problems in the RX standalone application, or you can park the assistant or a desired module on the track that you'd like to clean up in your digital audio workstation. I should also mention that customers of RX can download Michael Brower's own repair presets that he uses for every mix. Check the pop-out link to get them. It's really important to treat those problems that I just mentioned before you start adding tools that boost the signal of the track, because then those pops and clicks will become even more obvious to the listener and distract them from the song. Other repair work might involve tuning and pitch correction. The most popular tuning work is done on the vocals and the bass, two mix elements that are often off-pitch. For this, you can use a tool that comes free with your purchase of Nectar called Melodyne Essential. This is a great app for quickly making pitch alterations to your vocals, bass, or whatever really that needs tuning. Now, alternatively, you can use automatic pitch correction in Nectar's pitch module or Crispy Tuner from Brainworks Audio. Now, hopefully you didn't pass out from boredom reading that title card, but trust me, this is a really important part of mixing that beginner mix engineers don't know about or forget all the time. If you ignore polarity and or phase issues, this usually leads to a dull, hollow drum sound and a dull, hollow mix overall. Let's first define polarity and phase in a mixing context. Phase typically refers to time of arrival differences. So let's say you have a multi-mic'd drum kit with separate mics on the toms, kick, snare, overheads, etc. When you bring all those recorded sources together in a digital audio workstation, you'll notice that at a waveform level, even though everything was recorded properly and the sounds are all there, the waveforms look out of sync. Some peaks are ahead and some are behind. Maybe they're all over the place. This is because the sounds from the drums reached the microphones at different times because the mics were positioned in different locations across the source, the drum kit. What I've just described is a time of arrival phase problem. When this occurs, you'll play back what you've got in your DAW and you'll probably notice that the drums don't sound rich and deep. They lack the emotional expressiveness of the drummer's performance. Now don't worry, we'll talk about solving that issue in a moment. Let's quickly define polarity. Polarity refers to the direction of the waveform, either positive or negative. In mixing, you'll want to get into the habit of polarity switching or summing. Polarity switching or summing refers to reversing the polarity of the waveform so that the positive part of the waveform becomes negative and the negative part of the waveform, you guessed it, becomes positive. Experimenting with inverting polarity, especially on drums, can result in more low-end definition and reinforcement of the drum elements because the way the drums were originally recorded included a polarity relationship that's now counterproductively affecting the drum sound and your mix overall. This can happen when you've double mic'd a source like a snare drum or even a guitar, DI plus amplifier. To fix polarity problems, go into your DAW and experiment with the polarity relationships of double mic'd sources, or really any multi-mic'd sources. To do this, choose one source to be the anchor. Let's say the top mic'd snare track, and the bottom mic snare track is going to be the non-anchor. Solo the top and bottom snare mics and use the polarity invert switch in relay or neutron on the bottom mic's snare track. What you should listen for is audible low-end reinforcement. In other words, more low-end power hitting than if you hadn't flipped the polarity. If the sound gets thicker and more powerful, you've adjusted the polarity of the bottom snare mic for the better and improve the overall drum sound. You can do the same with the snare and overheads. Just solo that anchor snare again and solo the overhead drum tracks and press the polarity switch to invert the waveform on the overheads to see if more low-end reinforcement is achieved. Now, back to time of arrival differences and how to fix them. To fix time of arrival phase differences, you've got some options. Many people use the close-mic'd snare as their timing anchor in this situation. It acts as the timing source of truth, so you'll want to drag all the other drum tracks that are ahead or before it so that the peaks line up with the snare peaks from that close mic. You can do this by looking at the waveform for visual spill of that snare and then lining everything up correctly so that the peaks are synced up. To see this polarity summing and phase lining work in action, check out the pop-out link above to watch Enrique Gonzalez Mueller perform this on a real mix in our free mixing series, Are You Listening? So once your drums are lined up and phase coherent, you can now take the time to replace and/or enhance drum kit elements with samples. How you go about doing this is totally up to you. Some plugins have samples that can be triggered by the audio source you're trying to replace, and some engineers prefer converting their audio tracks to MIDI and using a tool like Native Instruments Battery. There's even tools like Easy or Superior Drummer that act as digital audio workstations for drums. Do a little bit of research and homework to find the right sample replacement enhancement process that works for you and the mixes you find yourself working on. Now that your drums, keys, vocals, and the rest are labeled and colored and grouped and bussed appropriately, it's important to take the extra step of removing any dead air from the tracks that don't have sound constantly running from the start to the finish of the song. For example, if the toms were close mic'd, they can be edited so as to only appear in your DAW when the hits are audible. Now you might be thinking, isn't there an important spill on those tom tracks? And by spill, I mean the sound of the rest of the kit bleeding into the close mic'd tom. The answer is, depending on how they were mic'd, the spill could contribute to a sound or a vibe that you're after if you wanted to leave the spill in and not edit them as I'm recommending right now. Perhaps it sounds thicker and warmer with the spill retained, or it could contribute to unwanted noise buildup. Whatever you do is up to you, and if it sounds good, it is good. Feel free to trim other waveforms that don't have sonic information constantly running throughout the song. Guitar solos, percussion sequences, background vocals, and ad-libs are all great candidates for this kind of pruning. Once you do this, it's important then to use the fade tools in your DAW so you don't get clicks and pops when the audio on the waveform runs out. Figure out the easiest way to do this in your DAW. Often, it's just by making a selection and then pressing something like Command or Control and then F to add fades at the beginning and ends of the waveform. To go a step further in controlling noise, you could add a noise gate. A noise gate sounds like it is. It's a device that silences audio signals below a specified threshold, effectively reducing or eliminating background noise or hum in audio recordings. A lot of people use gates on drums, especially the snare and kick. You'll find really capable gates in iZotope's Neutron, along with really helpful presets that say the name of the instrument profile they're best suited to gate. Now, once again, I can almost hear the pros saying, but bleed is good. Decide for yourself with some experiments. And remember, if it sounds good, it is good. So now you can start to approach building the foundation of the mix with what's sometimes known as a fader mix. I can't overstate how crucial this phase of the mix is. Getting this part right will mean way less work in later stages of mixing. A fader mix is mostly just that. Let all the tracks play and then scrub around your volume faders in the DAW, bring them up or down depending on what you hear and what you like. But what if you don't know where to start? Ultimately, it depends on what you're mixing, but here's some things to consider. Vocals are usually going to be louder than everything else. By how much is up to you. Second to that is drums, with snare usually being as loud as the vocal in some genres. Overheads can sit behind the drums. Same with percussion elements like shakers and tambourines. If you're confident, you can start panning percussion left or right in the stereo field. Same with drum elements. You can also create what's called the drummer's perspective by placing the kick in the middle, the rack toms in the center and center right, the floor tom on the bottom right, and the hi-hat on the left. Even though we're calling it a fader mix, panning is usually included in this foundational step. After that, bring the bass track or tracks in until you feel you've got a nice groove going with the drums. And by the way, it's completely okay to mute certain tracks as you build your fader mix. So for example, muting the vocals to find that bass and drum groove is totally acceptable. And just so you know, the bass can be right up the middle, panning-wise. Then, if you have them, bring the guitars in. They can be panned left or right and or center, and usually sit a touch louder than the bass, but not so loud that they obscure the bass. Keyboards, pads, and or synths can come in now. You've also got a lot of creative opportunities with their panning, as they're not critical instruments like vocals, kick, and snare, which usually need to be in the center for power and attention. Stop working on the fader mix when you feel like what you're hearing sounds like a strong demo of the song. Maybe it doesn't have the clarity, effects, and polish of a finished product, but the foundation is there, and you should start to hear the final mix coming together. I should mention that iZotope has tools to help you with this fader level process if you're looking for a head start. Balance Assistant in iZotope Neutron can jumpstart the fader mix process. And Visual Mixer can help you pan things in the stereo field visually, a little bit like an air traffic controller guiding all the sounds around in the air. Check the links in the description to see how to get up and running with both of those tools. I should also say that if you want to get a little outside inspiration for how and where to level and pan your mix elements, it's always a great idea to have a reference track to switch to. Just keep in mind that reference tracks are usually finished, polished mixes that are ahead of where you are in the fader mix stage. So just focus on the level of things in the reference mix and their position in the stereo field. To learn more about reference mixes and how to use them in your own work, check the pop-out link above. Once the fader mix is strong, it's time to start turning that collection of good tracks into something great. So we're going to talk about compression, EQ, time-based effects, and more. But before we get started talking about individual track processing, I want to talk about mix bus processing. Many mixers use low ratio compression with about 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction on the mix bus to glue their mix together, often with a VCA style compressor. People usually place a compressor on that mix bus once they've finished all their individual track processing. Something I want you to consider is placing a compressor there before you start mixing individual tracks. Compression of this nature could have impacts on individual tracks and the processing that you've worked really hard on. So rather than doing all that individual processing work on your tracks, adding a stereo bus processor like a compressor at the end, and then going back to the tracks often one by one to adjust based on the effect of that glue compressor, you could add one early on in the mixing stage and continue individual track processing from there. Now onto individual track processing. Just like we discussed in the fader mix session, try to work on clusters of similar instruments at a time. Obviously, the genre and style of music is going to dictate which and how much of an EQ, compressor, saturation tool you'll use. So I'll try to make some broad recommendations that will be helpful for you. For individual track processing, I'd highly recommend placing an instance of Neutron on the track and running the track assistant. This is a great way to get started because Neutron will listen to the track, identify the source, and then build you a custom chain, which you can further tweak to taste. I'd recommend beginning with the drums. That's the foundation, really, of any mix. Contrast is always a good idea in a mix, so experiment with distortion on your overheads, but keep your individual drum elements a little cleaner. You can add rumble to toms and kick with tools like the EQ in Neutron, low-end focus in Ozone, or BX Subsynth from Brainworks. You can add snap to snare with the punch compressor in Neutron. I should also say that some people discard the overhead and room tracks for drums altogether. And it's up to you to do this or not, and in many cases the client too. Trust your ears and yourself. Another technique people use on drums, and elsewhere in the mix for that matter, is high passing, allowing high frequency content to pass, and scooping out the low using an EQ. This is done to tamp down on muddiness that's caused by tracks that are needlessly contributing to the overall low-end composition of a mix. Make sure you use gentle filters for this, with 6 or 12 dB per octave slopes. Good candidates for this kind of scooping would be the snare, percussion elements like tambourines and shakers, hi-hats, and other high-frequency elements in the rhythm section. Once the drums are in a good place, move on to the bass guitar track or tracks. If you've got a DI and amp bass guitar track set, you could use both or just go with whichever one sounds best. One trick that many mixers use is they have one bass for top end and another bass for low end. This means placing an EQ on both bass tracks and carving out the respective frequency zones for each. Now you can experiment with processing and level control for each, depending on what the mix needs and obviously what sounds good. Also, it's a great idea to make sure that the kick and bass can be heard respectively, as they can often overlap in frequency spread. Neutron's unmasking module is great for this. Just make sure you've got one of the sources as the sidechain input and use the processing to separate the two until neither is clouding the other. Next is vocals. Make sure you've sorted out all the problems that we discussed earlier, so clicks, P-pops, plosive, etc. Provided you have, you're in the clear to start processing the vocal. I'd recommend using Nectar 3 Plus's assistant here. So after some questions were answered in the menu, it'll listen and then use compression, EQ, reverb, auto leveling, de-essing to make sure that you're set up for a polished, pro-sounding vocal. You can tweak it from here to taste. Pay special attention to that de-esser in the chain and make any adjustments if sibilants, so strongly stressed consonants, S sounds, can be heard. Make sure to use the output slider on the far right of Nectar to regulate the loudness of the vocals against the rest of the tracks that you've mixed, and the mix as a whole. If you're curious about how loud the vocal should be, I hesitate to give you loudness targets to hit in decibels, but here's some things to keep in mind. For a pop mix, the vocals should be the loudest thing. For rap and hip hop, they're usually loud too, perhaps less than a pop mix, but still loud. One rule of thumb is that some mixers out there will try to match the vocal to the same loudness as the snare track, especially in rap and hip hop. Take it or leave it. For rock, vocals are usually loud, but sometimes there's a little bit of surface tension with them and the rest of the mix to give the perception that the band is playing together live in front of you and the singer's singing over the rest of them. Back to lead vocal processing. It's common to have the same combination of processing modules from one vocal to the next. So if you have other prominent vocals, Option plus clicking and dragging Nectar from one to another and adjusting the output level can save you a lot of time. For background vocals and ad-libs, it's often a good idea to band, high, or low pass them so that they don't clash with other vocals. Nectar has some great background and ad-lib presets to explore, by the way. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about reverb and delay on vocals, or drums for that matter? That's coming up in the next tip, so sit tight. Guitars, whether acoustic or electric, usually always benefit from some compression. Neutron's assistant or the other individual presets in the compressor module will be helpful here. Acoustic guitars love the chorus effect. A little goes a long way. Electric guitars typically benefit from being softened a little bit by bandpass EQing to defang them. It's also not uncommon to use a de-esser, especially on fizzy electric guitars. Now, while you're doing your guitar work, it's really important that you don't overprocess guitars, as guitarists and tracking engineers work really hard to find and record great guitar tones. Overcooking their takes in the mixing stage can undo their important work, so be mindful of how you handle their 6-string or 12-string guitar sometimes. And if you're dealing with an acoustic guitar that's especially squeaky when the player changes chords, check out De-Squeak in iZotope RX. We'll leave a pop-out link above on how to use the module in a mix. Now, choosing which guitars to keep in the mix, especially in a rock session, is up to you. You'll often find DI and amped guitars. When too many guitars come together, you gotta be careful because especially if they were recorded with high gain, they can often take over the mix. So be diligent with your layering and EQing to get the right combination of power and control in guitars. Now, hopefully you experimented with panning in the fader mix tip with respect to your guitars. If you haven't already, experiment with panning them now. Hard panning clusters of guitars left or right can sound really great and keep them out of the way of the vocal, snare, and kick. Experiment with what sounds good. Pads and keyboards are typically decorative elements that fill out a mix and support it rather than take center stage. Experiment with their placement and also pay extra attention to potential clashing between keys and vocals. Nectar 3 Plus has an auto unmasking feature which can tell a source like piano or pad to duck every time the vocal is present. Give it a shot if you find that your vocals are getting clouded up from pads or keys, especially right-hand piano. Pads and keys also benefit from time-based effects like delay and reverb, which we'll talk more about right now. It's really important to set up a series of auxes on which you can place effects like reverb and delay. Once you've set up your auxes, place time-based effects tools on them like Neoverb or the BX2500 delay from Brainworks. For reverb, it's common to create several auxes with reverbs that have different jobs. A reverb for the vocal will get one aux. Make another aux for reverb for the background vocals, and another for reverb for the drum kit. Reverb on drums might sound kind of weird, but many mixers like to place their drums in a simulated space just to give it a bit of glue. If you're new to programming a reverb, Neoverb's assistant is great for getting you pointed in the right direction quickly. It'll automatically listen to the source and make sure that the reverb doesn't cloud it. For delay aux setup, some mixers like to set up multiple delays with different note values. A quarter note delay aux, a slapback delay aux for vocals, an eighth note delay aux, etc. Once the auxes are set up, send the instruments you want to be affected over to them through a bus. Now, not everything needs to be sent there, but here's some helpful pointers. A slapback delay for your vocals is usually a really good idea. Sending your main vocal or vocals to a quarter or eighth note delay is a great idea too. Experiment with both. Try creating an aux for your background vocals that has dreamy reverb and delay for an airy quality. For ad-libs, they're usually complemented by a nice ping-pong delay effect. So set up an aux that just says ping-pong. Now for other mix elements like sound effects and even ad-libs, try creating a dreamy, experimental, crazy delay that's triggered every so often throughout the course of the arrangement. Time-based effects aren't the only thing you can set up on your auxes. You can also use distortion or compression, even a little EQ in parallel on an aux. This involves setting up an aux with sometimes over-the-top processing parameters on your compressor or EQ, whatever's parked there, and then having several of your tracks sent to it to be processed and folded back into the dry signal. This is called parallel processing, and it's another way to enhance mix elements. But be careful with this technique because if your routing is set up incorrectly, or if you send too much signal back to the source, you could end up overcooking your audio and undoing a lot of important work you did in the individual processing stage. It's a good rule of thumb to start with the fader at 0 and slowly bring it in until you like what you hear. Stop increasing that send level when you find that the nature of the sound is getting too processed. And one more really important rule of thumb for auxes is to make sure that your reverbs and delays or time-based effects are set to 100% wet on those auxes. So you're only sending the wet signal back into the mix. Automation is the key to making a good mix a great mix. And there's several kinds of automation to program. One of them is volume automation. Use volume automation to make sure that certain rapped or sung words, guitar solos, or special moments can be heard. Performing this automation is simple. Just open up the automation controls in your DAW and look for volume or clip depending on your DAW, and then draw little boosts of 0.5 to 1 dB of loudness depending on what needs to be highlighted with the pencil tool. Some very bold mixers often use volume automation on their stereo bus track to make the choruses pop by 0.5 dB. You can also automate the sends of your auxes in case you need a splash of distortion, delay, or reverb, or anything else to stimulate the ears of your listeners. To learn more about automation and how to deploy it, you can check out an episode of Are You Listening from Season 5 with Enrique. After the mix is largely finished, creatively speaking, the final steps are no less important. First, the mix needs to be delivered to the client for their approval. Then, any required revisions can be made and approved. And lastly, the mix should be delivered to the mastering engineer. If you plan on mastering the project yourself, you should check out everything you need to know by watching the mastering focused seasons of Are You Listening? When you're ready to bounce or print your mix, you have to decide what format, bit depth, and sample rate you'll print. If you're going to send your mix to get mastered, keep all the parameters the same as the audio files in your mix. By doing this, you're also maintaining the audio quality of your file and allowing the mastering engineer the possibility to do bit depth or sample rate conversion at the final stage with higher quality conversion tools. Here's some things to think about as you continue your journey in mixing records. Practice listening. Train your ears to pick out specific elements in commercial mixes, and you should be able to identify any issues that need to be addressed, even in someone else's mix. Experiment with different techniques. Mixing is an art. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Experiment with techniques and find what works best for you. All the tricks that are now common, like parallel compression, all buttons in on the 1176 compressor, even distorting analog gear for rich saturation, were the result of experimentation. Don't just get and use the tools. Try to be creative with them. Be patient. Mixing takes time and patience and practice. So take your time. Don't rush through the process. Keep learning. It's a lifelong process. Stay up to date with the latest mixing techniques, tools, trends in the industry, and stay up to date with this channel while you're at it. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have some essential mixing tips of your own, leave them in the comments for others to learn. Take care. Happy mixing.